The undercover owner buys a truck at his dealership, but it stops cold when he hears a customer behind him. Edward Langston tapped his fingers against the worn steering wheel of his dusty old sedan, parked just across from the spotless glass facade of Langston Autohaus, his flagship showroom in Iron Ridge, Texas. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Chrome reflections, clean lines, rows of gleaming pickups lined up like trophies. But something had been gnawing at him lately. Sales were steady, the numbers looked good, but the reviews, they had started to sting. Complaints about hidden charges, manipulative financing, customers leaving confused or worse, betrayed. Edward had built this business from scratch 20 years ago, with nothing but grit, borrowed money, and a promise to his late father that he'd run things better than the sharks who once took advantage of their family. And now he wasn't so sure he had kept that promise. That's why, instead of pulling up in his black Range Rover, wearing the usual tailored suit and polished shoes, he was dressed in faded jeans, work boots scuffed from an old job site, a worn plaid shirt, and a cap pulled low enough to hide the lines of recognition. His salt and pepper beard had been left to grow rough, and the Rolex on his wrist had been swapped for a cheap digital watch from the local gas station. No one inside would recognize him, especially not the newer hires. Edward had been spending most of his time expanding to other states, letting trusted managers run day-to-day operations. But trust, he was starting to learn, didn't always guarantee integrity. So today, he wasn't Edward Langston. Today, he was Frank Dawson, a 53-year-old contractor looking to replace his old work truck. As he stepped out of the car and adjusted his hat, he glanced toward the showroom window. Inside, Victor Sloan, his recently promoted regional manager, stood with his arms folded, eyes scanning the lot with the hunger of a man who never let anything walk away without a price tag. Edward felt a chill. He took a breath and walked across the lot, not as a boss, but as a customer about to find out how his empire truly treated the people who walked through its doors. What he would uncover would change everything. It had been 20 years since Edward Langston had sold his first truck on a dusty lot in Iron Ridge, Texas. Back then, all he had was a dream, a handshake, and a beat-up sign that read, Langston Autohaus, built on trust. That sign was still there, but lately, the trust? He wasn't so sure. That morning, Edward didn't show up in a suit. He didn't drive his Cadillac. He didn't park in the reserved CEO spot. Instead, he pulled into the lot in a faded old Dodge Dakota, wearing steel-toed boots, jeans with dust on the knees, and a gray flannel shirt. His stubble was real, and the story he carried with him, Frank Dawson, 53, local contractor, was close enough to truth to believe. And Kyle, a young, eager salesman with a smile that came too quick, didn't recognize him. Morning, sir. Welcome to Langston Autohaus. I'm Kyle, the kid beamed, adjusting his tie like it still felt foreign around his neck. Looking for something in particular? Edward squinted at the rows of trucks, pretending to be overwhelmed. Something tough, he murmured. Need it for work. Got about $35,000 cash. Looking to replace the one that's finally giving out. Kyle's grin widened. Oh, you came to the right place. He gestured toward a row of higher-end F-15s and Silverados, the kind that started closer to 40. Let me show you one of our best options. As they walked, Edward caught the glint in Kyle's eyes, the kind that meant commission. Nothing wrong with that. Sales was a game of survival, but what came next made Edward's gut twist. This one's a little above budget, Kyle admitted, but it comes with our Langston protection package, paint sealant, extended roadside, anti-theft etching, all mandatory, of course. Company policy. Mandatory? Edward's jaw didn't tighten. Not visibly, but inside he logged it. The protection package was optional. Always had been. It was one of the few principles Edward had carved into the dealership's playbook. Give the customer choice. And yet here it was, mandatory. He bent over the truck, opened the hood, and nodded like he was inspecting the engine. Kyle kept talking about towing capacity, Bluetooth, and financing options, but Edward wasn't listening. He was watching. Through the reflection in the chrome, he saw the showroom window. Inside stood Victor Sloan, arms folded, expression unreadable behind glass. The regional manager, the one Edward had trusted to run Iron Ridge in his absence. Their eyes didn't meet. Victor had no reason to recognize this weathered contractor standing in the lot. But Edward felt something, a tightening in his chest, the kind of tension you can't name yet, but know is real. Back inside, the air was cooler, and so was the tone. Kyle sat across from him, tapping nervously on the keyboard. "Base price is $37,000, he said, but with processing, protection, and dealer prep." "Whoa," Edward interrupted gently. "Thought it was 35 flat." Kyle hesitated, glanced toward Victor's office. "Yeah, well, there are always a few extras." A few extras. Edward didn't press, not yet. He let Kyle slide the preliminary paperwork across the table. Numbers were shifting already. Fees were stacking like bricks. But then, something caught Edward's attention. A voice, not Kyle's, not Victor's, from the desk just behind them. And it wasn't loud. Not at first, but the pain in it, the kind that's bone deep, made Edward stop writing, mid-signature. "I don't have another 3,000, the man said quietly. "I gave you everything I had." Edward froze, turned his head just slightly, and saw a man about his age, Richard Torres, according to the paperwork he clutched. Standing with tears welling in his eyes, a red uniform shirt damp with sweat. His hands gripped a folder so tightly that the edges were curling. "Please," Richard said again, his voice breaking. "My daughter's starting school next week. I just need the truck to get to work. You promised the price wouldn't change." And standing in front of him, calm and calculated, was Victor Sloan. "Sir," Victor said smoothly, "I understand your situation, but the fees are non-negotiable. If you can't pay by Friday, we'll cancel the sale. You'll lose the deposit." Richard's shoulders sagged. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just folded. And Edward Langston, sitting just 10 feet away in disguise, felt something boil in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but something worse. Recognition. Because he'd seen that moment before, in his own father's eyes long ago, when they were told a deal had changed last minute, and they could either accept it or lose everything. Edward looked down at the contract in front of him, then he looked back up. This wasn't just about trucks. This was about who they were becoming, and he wasn't going to sit back and watch it happen again. Not this time. Not in his house. The silence that followed Richard's quiet plea was the loudest thing in the room. Edward didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, still in his Frank Dawson disguise, watching a grown man beg without raising his voice. It wasn't the desperation that gripped Edward the hardest. It was the dignity. Richard Torres stood with his spine straight, but his heart unraveling. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he pushed forward the papers, contracts, quotes, maybe even a family photo, the kind people carry for strength, not decoration. "I did everything right," Richard said softly. "I asked all the questions. Josh told me 32. I sold my old van, put every cent I had into that down payment." Victor didn't blink. "Josh no longer works here," he said flatly. "Verbal quotes aren't binding. It's the written agreement that matters." Mr. Torres Edwards' eyes narrowed. Josh. That was the name Kyle had mumbled earlier. Someone who refused to play along. Someone who was now no longer with the company. Victor reached for a folder, pristine, no coffee stains, no corner folds, and flipped it open like it was a performance he'd rehearsed. "The fee adjustments," he said, pointing to a dense line of fine print, "are standard across the board. Market fluctuation, warranty upgrades, and delivery surcharges. It's all in there." Richard blinked slowly, like he hadn't slept in days. "I'm not trying to get out of anything. I just can't afford this. We were counting on this truck. It's how I pay my bills. My daughter's tuition is due next month." Victor folded his hands. "If you can't pay, we'll have to terminate the agreement. The cancellation clause is clear. You'll forfeit your $5,000 deposit." Edward felt it before he processed it, a wave of heat rising to his neck. Not from anger, not exactly. It was a deeper ache, a betrayal, because this wasn't just bad service. It was a machine, a predatory system dressed in suits and paperwork, slick smiles, printed policies, legal theft with a fountain pen, and worst of all, it was happening in his name. Edward turned slightly, pretending to stretch his back, and caught a clearer look at Richard. The man wasn't just someone who'd been wronged. He was a mirror. That same quiet endurance, that same unwillingness to yell, that same weight behind his eyes. The weight of a man trying to keep a family afloat while the world pretends not to see him drowning. Edward clenched his jaw, then loosened it. Breathe, he reminded himself. Stay Frank Dawson. Stay in character. But his hand slowly reached into his coat pocket. His thumb found the small notch of the recorder tucked into the lining. He didn't press play, not yet, but the red light blinked, waiting. Victor leaned back. We can hold the vehicle until Friday, but after that, the deal's void. You'll need to restart the entire process, assuming you can. The way he said assuming made Edward sick. Richard gave a small, defeated nod. Not agreement, just resignation. He gathered his papers slowly, like folding away the last pieces of hope. A photo slipped out again. 3 kids around a cake, one of them wearing a handmade graduation sash. Edward's breath caught. Victor didn't even glance at it. Richard turned and walked toward the exit. No one followed. No one apologized. No one even thanked him for coming in. And that was the moment something cracked. Not in Richard. He'd already been broken. But in Edward Langston. He watched the showroom return to its rhythm. Phones ringing, sales chatter. Kyle walked back over with a nervous smile. Sorry about that, the kid said. Some people just don't get how this business works. Edward looked up slowly. Kyle didn't know who he was talking to, didn't realize he was describing the man who built this business, but Edward just nodded softly. Yeah, I guess some people don't. He reached out and turned the contract in front of him sideways, not to read it, but to see it through new eyes. The protection fees, the processing fees, the add-ons, the ballooned final number, a mirror of Richard's nightmare, and now his own. But the real price wasn't in the ink. It was in what they'd become. This place, this business, this family. Edward leaned back in the chair and let the guilt settle across his chest. Not because he caused this, but because he'd left the door open long enough for it to grow. Victor Sloan wasn't a rogue actor. He was a symptom. The disease was deeper. And if Edward wanted to save this place, he couldn't just fire a man. He'd have to face the entire system, even if that meant tearing down what he once called a legacy. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. Not from rage, though it simmered quietly under his skin, but from clarity. The kind that doesn't roar. The kind that whispers, "You left the gate open, and wolves moved in." He replayed Richard Torres's voice in his head, the way it cracked when he said, "We've been planning this purchase for months." Edward stared at the ceiling of his motel room, the kind with buzzing lights and a TV remote missing half the buttons, the kind that reminded him of who he used to be, the kind that helped him remember what mattered. By morning, he was back in the parking lot before the sun had even lifted the fog off the pavement. The cold air bit at his cheeks, and his breath curled like smoke. Kyle wasn't in yet, but Edward waited, not at the showroom doors, at the back, by the employee entrance. Because if you want the truth, you don't walk through the front. You catch it before people have time to rehearse. Kyle arrived 10 minutes later, hoodie on, coffee in hand, earbuds in. When he saw Edward standing there, he nearly dropped the cup. "Oh, hey, Mr. Dawson, right?" Edward nodded. "Didn't want to interrupt the sales rush. Got a minute?" Kyle hesitated, then gave a shrug, casual but unsure. "Yeah, I guess." They walked to the small picnic bench near the loading dock. Nobody else is around. Just 2 men, one young, trying to make his way up, the other older, pretending he hadn't already built the ladder. Edward let the silence stretch until Kyle spoke first. "Look, if this is about yesterday, I'm sorry. That guy, Richard, I felt bad too, but there's nothing I can really do." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Nothing you can do or nothing you're allowed to?" That landed. Kyle looked away, then back. "It's complicated." Edward's voice softened. "Try me." And for a moment, Kyle just sat there, caught between fear and conscience. Then he said it. Have you ever felt like doing the right thing is the fastest way to get yourself fired? Edward said nothing, just nodded. Kyle's voice dropped. Victor has this system. You quote low at first, friendly, no pressure. Then once the customer is emotionally committed, you introduce the add-ons, extended warranties, premium packages, mandatory protection fees. He did air quotes with 2 fingers. Mandatory my ass. Edward leaned forward. What happens if you don't play along? Kyle laughed, hollow, bitter. You get reassigned to Sunday mornings, Tuesday lunch hours, dead zones. Try making commission when no one's shopping. And if you still don't play along? Edward asked. Kyle hesitated, then said a name that made Edward freeze. Derek Hall. Edward knew that name. He'd interviewed Derek himself during a rare hiring round 2 years ago. Young, former Marine, clean record, honest eyes. Derek spoke up, Kyle continued. Once, told Victor he wasn't comfortable massaging the numbers. Next week, his sales tanked. Week after that, he was gone. Official reason? Not meeting quota. Edward's stomach turned. He stared at his hands the way they were clasped on the table. Strong hands, but suddenly they felt distant. Like they'd built something, only to watch it rot from within. And Josh? Edward asked. Kyle nodded slowly. Same thing. Josh was helping Richard, told him up front what the real price was. Victor overheard the call. Fired him that afternoon. Edward exhaled through his nose, steady. And the others? Most just go along, Kyle said, voice quiet now. Some actually think it's normal, part of the game. Edward watched a delivery truck rumble past the fence. The sky had started to brighten, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like an awakening. Have you ever thought about leaving? Edward asked. Kyle nodded. Every week. So why stay? Kyle looked down, then met Edward's gaze and said the most honest thing yet. My mom's got medical bills. I help cover them. I don't like what's happening here, but I can't afford to start over. There it was, the quiet hostage situation, the one most people never see, not behind locked doors, not in chains, but in rent payments, in medical bills, in fear. Edward placed a hand on the table, not to reassure, but to anchor himself, because this wasn't just about saving customers. It was about rescuing the ones inside the system too. Kyle broke the silence once more. You're not just another customer, are you? Edward looked at him, not with surprise, but with a hint of quiet respect. No, he said simply, but I need you to keep thinking I am for just a little longer. Kyle blinked, then nodded slowly. Edward rose from the bench and offered his hand. Kyle shook it firmly. Thanks for being honest, Edward said. Kyle's voice was barely above a whisper. Don't let them bury this, please. I won't. As Edward walked back toward the front lot, a new fire burned behind his eyes. He wasn't just collecting proof anymore. He was gathering witnesses. The truth was cracking through the concrete, and now it was time to expose the whole machine. The rest of the morning unfolded like a carefully rehearsed illusion. On the surface, everything sparkled. The showroom glass gleamed. The trucks lined up outside looked flawless under the rising sun. The team wore clean polos, smiles prepped, and greetings ready. There was laughter, casual conversation, the kind of polished atmosphere you'd expect at one of the state's top dealerships. But Edward knew better, because once you've seen the shadow behind the curtain, the stage never looks the same. He moved slowly, quietly, taking everything in. Not as a CEO, but as a man looking for cracks. He watched Kyle return to his desk, greeted by 2 other salesmen with a nod and a forced smile. One of them, Mason, had that too-slick confidence that doesn't just sell, but sells over people. The kind of guy who could read hesitation in a handshake and twist it into a close. Edward hovered near the finance desk, pretending to look at a brochure while eavesdropping on a woman asking about her payment schedule. The finance rep, a man named Theo, explained it with a warm voice but quick fingers, flipping past the fine print, highlighting only what was rehearsed. Edward's eyes narrowed when he saw the phrase "protection plan included" appear again. No mention of choice, no mention of opt-out. It wasn't just a sales tactic, it was baked into the entire flow. He stepped away and wandered toward the back hall, where a printed board listed Employee of the Month. Victor Sloan's name stood out in bold under the words Leadership Excellence. A chill passed through Edward's spine. As he turned the corner, he saw a door slightly ajar, a training room. Inside, Victor was speaking to 4 new recruits. His voice was low, even-toned. He had that calm that masquerades as wisdom. But to Edward, every word was a confession. "You sell the emotion first," Victor was saying. "Make them see their family in that back seat. Make them imagine the lake house, the job, the better version of themselves. Once they feel it, they've already bought it. The paperwork? That's just math after the magic." The recruits chuckled nervously. Victor continued, "Now don't lie, just don't explain more than necessary. Customers don't know what they don't ask. Let them assume. And if they get cold feet, remind them how far they've already come. Nobody wants to walk away from a dream, especially in front of their spouse." Edward stood still in the hallway, his fingers tightening around the edge of a pamphlet. This wasn't training, it was grooming. Conditioning people to manipulate without technically breaking the rules, just bending them until the truth snapped. Victor closed his little sermon with a line that made Edward's blood go cold. "You're not here to sell cars," he said. "You're here to sell the idea that this is the only place they'll ever feel like they've made it." Edward turned and walked away. He needed air. Back in the showroom, he positioned himself near the lounge where customers waited for approvals. He spoke casually with a middle-aged man in overalls, a plumber named Nick, who was finalizing paperwork. "Yeah," Nick said, chuckling nervously. "They said the final cost might shift depending on credit score, taxes, whatever. I'm just glad it's happening. You know how long I've been saving for this?" Edward nodded. "They tell you what's included in the total?" Nick hesitated. "I think so. Some kind of platinum warranty. They just said everyone gets it." Edward didn't need to ask more. He knew what was happening. He asked if he could use the restroom, excused himself, and headed to the back once again. This time he ducked into the staff lounge when no one was watching. He found the contract copies left on the small printer tray. And there they were, 3 of them. Same pattern, same structure, base vehicle price, protection package, premium add-on, market adjustment fee, all bundled neatly, all non-negotiable, all lies by omission. As he slid one of the sheets into his coat, his phone buzzed. A text from Kyle. "Vic's watching you now. Be careful." Edward exhaled. The clock had started ticking. He wasn't invisible anymore. But that wasn't a problem. He had what he needed: testimony, behavior patterns, and now physical documents. One more piece and the trap could be set. As he stepped back into the main showroom, the light hit just right. And for a second, all the glossy surfaces, the polished tile floors, the chrome finishes on the trucks, the mirrored awards on the wall, they didn't reflect success. They reflected a system built on illusion. Edward knew what he had to do next. He wasn't just going to expose the rot. He was going to drag it into the light and make sure it never found shadows to hide in again. Frank Dawson, that is, Edward Langston in disguise, stood in the center of Victor Sloan's office, the light from the late afternoon sun catching faint dust in the air. He'd timed this moment with precision, late enough in the day that distractions were minimal, early enough that Victor wouldn't yet be in a rush to close up. Victor had the air of someone who'd played this game before. Leaning back in his leather chair, the manager steepled his fingers, an almost smug calm settling over him. "So," he said casually, "you had some questions about the protection package?" Frank nodded, his tone carefully restrained. "Yeah, it seemed like it wasn't exactly optional. Thought maybe we could work something out off the books. Just want a clean deal." Victor gave a slow smile. "I like a man who knows how to read between the lines." He rose from his chair and walked to the filing cabinet in the corner. "You're right, Frank. The package isn't really optional. But let's say," he turned, holding up a folder with one hand, "you slide an extra $1,500 my way in cash, and I can make that protection fee disappear from the system. Nobody bats an eye. You win. I win." Edward felt his stomach twist, but he only raised an eyebrow, masking the disgust. "And that's a normal arrangement here?" Victor laughed, leaning his hip against the cabinet. "You'd be surprised. It's cleaner than financing extra junk they never wanted. Look, customers think we're here to help them buy cars. We're here to sell dreams, Frank. We dress up a $28,000 truck with a $36,000 ribbon, and they still say thank you. There it was, the casual confession he had hoped for. Delivered without shame, without hesitation. Edward's phone, tucked into the front pocket of his flannel shirt, was quietly recording every word. "Does this kind of thing happen a lot?" Edward asked, lowering his voice, as if to show his complicity. Victor's eyes glinted. "Let's just say this location is outperforming every Langston Motors branch in the region. You think that's luck?" Edward kept his hand steady. Victor continued, the bravado rising with every sentence. "I mean, you saw that guy earlier. Richard Torres, right? Family man. Looked like he was gonna cry. The second I saw him walk in, I knew we could push him. Hit him with the market adjustment fee, the warranty upgrade, the service plan. He caved like clockwork. That's what pressure does." "You think Langston himself knows this is going on?" Edward asked carefully, watching every flicker in Victor's face. Victor smirked. "Edward Langston, the old man's too busy schmoozing investors and playing philanthropist. He hasn't set foot in Red River in over a year. Probably forgot we exist. That's the beauty of it." He dropped his voice lower. "He still thinks this place runs on trust. Hell, if he ever found out, it'd be too late anyway. Paperwork's clean. Staff loyal." Edward straightened just slightly, enough to breathe deeper. "And what if someone talks?" Victor chuckled. "They don't. Ask Derek Hall." Edward's heart skipped. He remained silent. Victor went on, oblivious. "Good kid. Too honest. He started warning customers about hidden fees. Refused to push the plans. I had no choice but to cut him. Made sure no one else followed his lead. That's how you keep control." The name Derek wasn't a casual drop. It was a warning. A trophy, even. Edward glanced at the floor for a beat, then met Victor's gaze. "And if someone does play along? Like me?" Victor leaned forward with a grin, pulling a drawer open and removing a blank contract. "Then you're one of the smart ones, Frank. Let me take care of you." Edward stared at the document. The very thing Victor believed would seal a dirty deal would now serve as the final nail in his career. He stood slowly. "Mind if I take a walk? Just want to get some fresh air before we finish." "Of course." Victor waved him off. "Take your time. The smart ones always come back." Edward turned and stepped out into the hallway, heart pounding. He'd heard enough, more than enough. Bribery, deception, corruption, spoken out loud like small talk. But what mattered most wasn't that Victor had confessed. It was that he had no idea who he'd just confessed to. The trap was nearly set, and Edward Langston was ready to spring it. The air inside Langston Motors, Red River, shifted the moment Edward stepped back into the main showroom. Evening sunlight streamed through the wide windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Sales reps were starting to close down their stations. The quiet hum of the HVAC system mingled with murmured conversations. No one looked up when Frank Dawson returned, but they would. Edward walked straight past the front desk and over to the customer intercom system, an old unit mounted on the wall near the finance office. He stared at it for a beat, then pressed the button. His voice, low but firm, echoed through every corner of the showroom. "Attention, all staff. Please report to the main floor immediately. This is Edward Langston." There was a pause, then footsteps. Chairs scraped, heads turned, and then the silence broke. Every employee froze. Kyle Murphy, halfway through closing his terminal, blinked as if seeing a ghost. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Victor Sloan emerged from his office, confusion painted across his face. "What the hell is going on?" He stopped cold. Edward stood calmly in the center of the showroom, no longer slouched, no longer hiding behind flannel and stubble. The baseball cap was gone. His posture had returned to that unmistakable presence of leadership. Victor's voice dropped into a whisper. "Langston?" Edward didn't even blink. "That's right." The room pulsed with stunned silence. Every eye was on them. Victor took one step forward. "Sir, Look, I can explain." "You will," Edward interrupted, "after we play something." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Victor's own voice filled the room. "Slide me an extra $1,500, and I can make that protection fee disappear." That guy earlier? Richard Torres. He caved like clockwork. Langston doesn't know. He hasn't set foot here in over a year. The showroom stood still. Even the humming vents seemed to hold their breath. Victor's face went pale. That's out of context. There are 3 hours of context, Victor. Would you like me to play the rest? Or should I just send it straight to the State Attorney General's office? Victor took a step back. This is entrapment. I didn't know it was you. That's the point, Edward said. You showed me who you really are when you thought I was powerless. Kyle looked like he wanted to disappear. Another salesman covered his mouth with a shaking hand. No one moved. Edward raised his voice, not in anger, but in conviction. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Edward Langston, founder of this company. I built Langston Motors with one promise. Customers first. No hidden fees, not verbal traps, and definitely not backroom bribes. He looked directly at Victor. You're fired, effective immediately, and I recommend you don't touch a single file on your computer. Our IT team is already creating backups. 2 security guards, summoned quietly by staff, appeared beside Victor. He didn't resist, just shook his head, muttering to himself as they escorted him toward the back office. Edward turned to the rest of the staff. I've spent the past few days undercover, pretending to be someone like the people we claim to serve, working-class folks trying to make an honest purchase. What I saw broke my heart. He paused, letting that land. I saw manipulation passed off as sales, honesty punished, customers tricked, employees afraid to speak. Then softer, almost like a father speaking to his children. But I also saw people who wanted to do the right thing. People like Kyle, who quietly questioned the system. People like Derek Hall, who was pushed out for having a conscience. Edward addressed the team again. Starting now, we're suspending all current contracts. Every deal over the last 6 months will be reviewed. Any customer who was overcharged will be contacted and made whole. Murmurs rippled through the group. Those of you who were part of the deception, this is your chance. Come forward, help us fix this, and we'll work through it. Hide it and you're done. No second chances. He turned to Kyle. You want to help me lead this cleanup? Kyle looked overwhelmed, but nodded. Yes, sir. Edward extended a hand. Then let's begin. Outside, the last light of the day cast a golden glow across the Langston Motor sign. Inside, something deeper was shifting. This wasn't just a company course correction. It was a cultural reset. And as staff stood in quiet awe, watching the man who had built it all from nothing take the lead once again, not as a CEO on a pedestal, but as one of them, the weight of change settled over the showroom, like sunlight breaking through a storm. The reckoning was here, and the rebuild had begun. It was quiet the next morning at Langston Motors. The kind of quiet that feels like a held breath, the calm after a storm, but before something new begins. Edward sat at the small customer lounge table, coffee in hand, reviewing a list of names. Contracts flagged for audit, people who had been misled, overcharged, or left feeling ashamed for trusting the wrong people. At the top of the list, Richard Torres. Just as Edward was about to ask someone to reach out, the front door swung open, and there he was. Richard stood still for a moment, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. His shirt was neatly ironed, same delivery logo on the chest, but this time, his eyes held less weight. Still tired, still cautious, but something about him said hope had survived the damage. Edward rose from his seat and crossed the floor. Mr. Torres, he said softly, I'm glad you came back. Richard blinked, his guard still half up. They said you wanted to see me, but I gotta be honest, I wasn't sure if this was some kind of trap. Edward shook his head. Not a trap, just a promise I intend to keep. He gestured toward the meeting room nearby, a clear glass space now repurposed for customer reconciliations. Richard followed, still wary. On the table sat a manila folder, a copy of his contract, handwritten notes, a full breakdown of every fee added. I went through everything myself, Edward said, sitting across from him. You were quoted $32,000, but with add-ons and hidden adjustments, we pushed you past $35,000 without consent. That's not just unethical, it's fraud. Richard lowered his eyes. I tried to fight, I really did. I thought maybe I was crazy for trusting people. Edward's voice softened. You weren't crazy. You were honest. That used to mean something around here. He opened the folder and pulled out a check. We're refunding every dollar above the original quote. That includes your deposit and the additional fees. You'll also receive the truck at the price you were promised. Richard stared at the check like it might vanish if he looked too long. Then he swallowed hard. My daughter, she starts school in 2 weeks. I didn't want to tell her we couldn't afford tuition because I got scammed trying to buy a truck. His voice broke. Edward leaned forward. Tell her tuition's covered. What do you mean? I've started a scholarship program for employees' families, customers, and community members. And your daughter's name is at the top of the list. For a long moment, Richard didn't speak. Then slowly, his hand came up to cover his mouth as his eyes welled with tears. Edward didn't rush him. He knew the feeling, the disbelief when injustice finally gives way to grace. When someone finally does the right thing, not because it benefits them, but because it's what should have been done all along. When Richard finally found the strength to speak, his voice was low. Why are you doing this? Edward looked him in the eye. Because I forgot what kind of business I wanted to run. And people like you, people who work hard, who raise kids with what little they have, deserve better. He slid the folder toward him. And because if we don't fix what we break, we don't deserve to lead. Outside the glass room, some of the staff had gathered, not out of curiosity but quiet respect. Kyle stood among them, arms folded, a thoughtful expression on his face. Richard stood up, gripping the check carefully, like it was more than just money, like it was the repair of something internal. You didn't have to do this, he said. I did, Edward replied. I just didn't realize it until too late. Richard reached out and shook his hand. Thank you, Mr. Langston. No, Edward said, returning the handshake with both hands. Thank you for reminding me why I built this place in the first place. As Richard turned to leave, the staff parted like a wave. No applause, no spectacle, just quiet nods and the kind of respect that no uniform or title can buy. The door closed behind him, but what he left behind was a message. The tide had turned. The poison was being drawn out, and Langston Motors, once a place of hidden contracts and buried integrity, had just taken its first public step toward redemption. Edward watched Richard walk across the lot, holding his check and his keys, not just to a truck, but to a life that wasn't stolen from him. And as the sunlight reflected off the hood of the vehicle, Richard would now drive home with pride. Edward felt something settle in his chest for the first time in a long while. Peace, not the kind that comes from success, but the kind that comes from setting things right. The next Monday morning didn't start like any other. There were no whispered jokes near the espresso machine, no quiet bets about which customer would get upcharged next, no meetings with fake smiles. Instead, Edward Langston stood at the center of the showroom with a folded piece of paper in his hand and a mission in his eyes. Behind him, the large screen that used to loop flashy ads now showed something very different. Langston Motors Transparency Commitment, effective today. One by one, the employees trickled in. Some looked uncertain, others quietly hopeful. Kyle Murphy was among the first, his tie slightly crooked, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes flicking from the screen to Edward. He still hadn't gotten used to seeing Frank Dawson like this. Upright, confident, clean-shaven, and unmistakably the Edward Langston. Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Some of you were forced to follow orders you didn't agree with. Others stayed silent to protect their jobs. I understand, but silence ends here. He let the words settle before continuing. This morning we're launching 3 things. First, a full refund program. Every customer who was misled, overcharged, or pressured into add-ons will be contacted directly. No excuses, no lawyers, just us, making things right. Several sales staff shifted uncomfortably. A few exhaled like they'd been waiting to hear that for months. Second, Edward said, lifting the paper slightly, I've reached out to someone who should never have been fired. There was a pause. Then the front door opened and in walked Derek Hall. His old name badge had been polished. His navy jacket was crisp, but the eyes were the same, sharp, steady, and above all, clean. Some of the younger staff gasped quietly. Derek had become something of a myth around the dealership, the guy who tried to do the right thing and disappeared for it. Edward turned toward him with a smile. "Derek, I'd like you to lead our new integrity and customer advocacy program." Derek blinked. "You're serious?" "I'm overdue to be," Edward replied. Derek nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then let's do it." As Derek took his place beside Edward, Kyle stepped forward, slowly, nervously. "I want in," he said, voice low but certain. "I stayed quiet before, but I want to do it right this time." Edward looked him in the eye. "Then it starts with your next customer." The third announcement came quietly. Each staff member was handed a folder with a new sales protocol. No hidden fees, full disclosure up front, and recorded customer walkthroughs for every transaction. The days of whispered premium add-ons were over. In the hours that followed, the changes spread like fresh air through an old house. Edward took calls himself, dialing down the list of affected customers, apologizing not as a CEO, but as a man who once lost sight of his values. In the back office, Derek sat with Kyle, walking him through the new checklist system. "Don't sell the car," he said plainly. "Sell the truth. If it's right for them, they'll come back. If it's not, they'll thank you anyway." At the front desk, a new sign was installed. No hidden fees, no pressure, no games, just the truth. Even the finance team had to adjust. The fine print was enlarged and the contract sections were color-coded. Every page was walked through with the customer, slowly, honestly. It felt strange at first, too slow, too exposed. But as the first few customers came in, single parents, young couples, retired veterans, the tension in the room didn't build like before. It lifted. People asked questions, staff answered them without tricks, and in that, trust began to grow. Late that afternoon, Edward stood by the window, watching as Derek walked a nervous young salesman through a trade-in evaluation, not to push numbers, but to explain them. Just beside them, Kyle sat with a middle-aged couple, pointing out every option line by line. No upselling, no dancing around totals, just calm, clear honesty. They left with a smile. No purchase that day, but they said they'd come back, and Edward believed them. Because trust doesn't sell on the first try. It grows, slowly, silently, like roots. And after months, maybe years of rot, Langston Motors was finally growing something worth keeping. That night, Edward stayed late. The lot was empty. The showroom was silent. He walked the floor once more, pausing in front of each desk, checking each form, noticing how the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was real. On the counter, Derek had left a sticky note that made Edward smile. "We're not selling dreams. We're selling dignity." It stuck with him, because in the end, that was always the point. And now, they were finally getting it right. It had been exactly 10 days since the shakeup, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the glass doors of Langston Motors opened to something rare in Red River. Genuine warmth. The old salesman's swagger was gone. In its place, honest conversations, real handshakes, and that subtle, invisible shift in the air, the kind that happens when people feel safe again. But Edward Langston wasn't celebrating just yet. He knew better than to trust applause after a performance. What he was waiting for was a return, because anyone could walk through the door once, but trust, real trust, only brings people back. He stood near the rear of the showroom that morning, just behind a line of new display trucks, sipping his usual black coffee from a plain ceramic mug. No luxury logo, no assistant hovering, just him, listening. And then the bell above the entrance chimed. A small family stepped in. Dad, mom, 2 kids trailing behind in sneakers too big for their stride. Edward knew that face instantly. The man was Luis Mendoza, a local contractor. 6 months ago, he'd walked out of Langston Motors furious, said he'd never come back after being quoted one price and charged another. Back then, he'd shouted, and rightly so. Now he was quiet, guarded. His wife looked around cautiously, as if waiting for someone to start pushing a clipboard into her hands. Edward stayed back, a silent observer once more. Kyle spotted them first. He was near the welcome desk, polishing a key display, and when he saw Luis, his shoulders straightened. Not with swagger, with responsibility. "Good morning," Kyle said, voice calm, unforced. "Thanks for coming in." Louis gave him a wary nod. "We're just looking." "No problem," Kyle said. "I'm just here if you have questions. Take your time. Prices are on the window stickers. Everything's up front now. No hidden fees, no surprises." Luis raised an eyebrow. His wife blinked. That was new. They walked through the lot slowly, the kids peeking into back seats, the parents checking trunk space. After a while, Luis circled back to Kyle with a quiet question about towing specs. Kyle didn't upsell. He didn't pivot to a more expensive model. He walked Luis out to a lower-priced vehicle and pulled out a laminated spec sheet. Then he stood back, arms at his sides, giving space. They talked for nearly 20 minutes. And when Luis asked, "Is this really the final price?" Kyle just nodded. "Everything's listed. What you see is what you get." Luis turned to his wife. She looked at Kyle, then at the vehicle, then back at Kyle. And for the first time in that family's journey, she smiled. Edward saw the moment. That little flicker of peace, the kind that's too quiet for a press release, but loud enough to shift a legacy. Luis approached the counter later that morning to begin paperwork. Not with skepticism, not with fear, but with choice. Later that afternoon, Edward sat with Derek in the training room. A few of the new hires were going through onboarding, and Derek had just finished a session about value-based sales. "We're not here to push people," he reminded them. "We're here to help people make decisions they're proud of a week later." In the corner, a young trainee raised his hand. "Sir, what if the customer doesn't buy?" Derek smiled. "Then we thank them, and we make it easy for them to come back when they're ready." That night, Edward walked the lot alone again. He paused in front of the truck Luis had bought, a modest F-150, no upgrades, no fluff. Just a reliable truck for a working man who'd been burned and still came back. That's what trust looks like, he thought. Not flashy, but steady. Not instant, but earned. And as he stepped back toward the building, Edward noticed something taped to the staff fridge. A handwritten note from one of the office team. "Today was the first day I didn't dread coming in. Thanks for bringing us back." He didn't know who wrote it. He didn't need to, because this wasn't just about saving face anymore, or fixing a system. This was about changing a culture. One customer at a time, one honest deal at a time. And tomorrow they'd keep going. The morning sun had barely risen over Red River when Edward Langston's phone buzzed with a notification that felt different. It wasn't a finance report, not an internal memo, not even a message from corporate. It was a headline. Undercover CEO exposes corruption at Red River dealership. Fires manager, refunds customers. The article was from a local business blog, not national news, not a massive media outlet. But in a town like Red River, it was a wildfire. By 9 a.m., the story had been picked up by the regional paper. By 10:15, it was trending on Facebook. And by noon, customers started walking through the glass doors, not just to buy, but to say thank you. Some just nodded in respect. Some came in for coffee and to shake a hand. And some, like an older man named Gerald, who'd been swindled out of a warranty upgrade 2 years ago, quietly said, "I didn't think anyone up top cared." But Edward cared, deeply. This wasn't just about headlines. It was about people, families, futures, which is why, that very afternoon, he called a staff meeting. Not in the office, not in the conference room, but out on the main showroom floor. Kyle, Derek, Tom from finance, the lot techs, the front desk, everyone gathered under the glow of a new sign Edward had installed above the customer welcome desk. "Trust is earned here." He stepped up beside it, dressed not in his tailored CEO suit, but in a soft gray button-down and scuffed boots. The same ones he wore the day he went undercover as Frank Dawson. "I know some of you are wondering what comes next," Edward began, his voice calm but full. "Some of you may still be processing what happened here, the dishonesty, the cover-ups, the betrayal, and that's fair. But what I want to talk about today is not who we were, but who we're becoming." Silence, then attention. He glanced around the room, pausing on Kyle, who stood a little taller now, on Derek, arms crossed but proud, on Tom, who'd started bringing in donuts for the early shift. "Integrity isn't a campaign," Edward said. "It's not a quota. It's a choice, one we make with every single customer. And from now on, that's the only metric that matters. He took a small envelope from his pocket, held it up. This, he said, is a scholarship offer. Fully funded by Langston Motors. It's named after someone we failed, and someone who reminded me why I built this business in the first place. He paused, voice catching. It's called the Isabella Torres Scholarship, and it's going to help kids from working families attend college, starting with Richard Torres's daughter. There were no cheers, just stillness, a kind of reverence. Kyle blinked fast. Derek's jaw tightened. Even the front desk rep quietly wiped at her cheek. And in that moment, it wasn't about publicity, it was about the promise. That afternoon, a local news crew arrived to cover the story. They interviewed Edward out by the lot entrance, next to a modest silver Tacoma and a row of trucks cleaned so thoroughly they reflected the sky. "We're not just rebuilding a dealership," Edward said to the camera. "We're rebuilding the meaning of a handshake, of a promise made across a desk, and of what happens when leadership doesn't hide behind titles but stands right here." The segment aired that night during prime time. Edward didn't watch it live. He was in the break room, reviewing a customer service survey with Kyle and Tom, rating each interaction based on clarity, respect, and fairness. But the next morning, Langston Motors woke up to hope. Customers lined up with questions, not suspicions. Former employees who had walked away during the dark days began calling back. Even Derek, once skeptical of the change, leaned over during a team lunch and said quietly to Edward, "Feels different now." Edward smiled. "It is." By the end of the week, a handwritten letter arrived from Richard Torres. It was short, just a folded sheet of paper with blue ink. "My daughter cried when I told her, not because of the money, but because someone she's never met believes she mattered. Thank you for reminding my family that people like you still exist." Edward kept that letter in his desk drawer, not for show, but for grounding, because he knew there would be setbacks, mistakes, maybe even people who still tried to cheat the system. But now the difference was this: the system itself had changed, and tomorrow it would keep changing, one honest sale at a time, one earned thank you at a time, and one scholarship at a time for every family they once failed. It had been nearly 6 months since Edward Langston walked into his own dealership as a stranger named Frank Dawson. Since then, the lot had changed. Not just the policies, not just the numbers, but the energy. The conversations by the coffee machine weren't hushed anymore. Sales meetings weren't about maximizing profit margins. They were about earning customer trust. And above the showroom desk, the sign still hung, "Trust is earned here." But what most people didn't know? Edward had been slowly packing up his corner office, not out of defeat, not out of shame, out of purpose. Because the mission, the culture, was no longer dependent on him. It was alive in someone else now. That someone stood in the break room early one morning, flipping through a printed list of new hire profiles. His name was Kyle Murphy, 24 years old, the same young man who once flinched under the pressure of unethical quotas, who had once looked over his shoulder before whispering the truth. Now he was the one building the future. Edward stood at the doorway, watching Kyle brief 2 new employees, a young woman fresh out of community college, and a quiet guy with more mechanic skills than sales experience. "Let me make something clear right now," Kyle said, his voice steady. "You won't get fired here for telling the truth. You won't lose a sale because you were honest. That's not how we work anymore." He held up a paper. "This," he said, pointing to the top corner, "this logo means something now. It's not just a badge. It's a contract with the customer and with yourself." Edward smiled to himself. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. Later that afternoon, Kyle knocked gently on Edward's half-packed door. "Got a sec?" he asked. Edward looked up. "Always." Kyle stepped in, holding a small envelope. "I wanted to give you this before you head out." Edward took it, opened it. Inside was a photograph, a candid shot of the sales floor, taken by one of the techs. It showed Kyle standing beside an elderly couple, explaining a price sheet in detail. The couple looked relaxed, smiling, safe. On the back, someone had written, "This is what you built." Edward exhaled. "I didn't build this alone," he said quietly. "You helped fix it." Kyle nodded, then hesitated. "Do you remember what you told me that first day? After the fallout, when you offered to stay?" Edward raised an eyebrow. "You said, it's not about being perfect. It's about not hiding from the mess you made." Edward chuckled. "Sounds like something I'd say." Kyle grinned. "It stuck with me." Edward stood, walked around the desk, and extended his hand. Kyle took it, a firm, confident grip. "I want you to take over the Red River branch," Edward said. "You've earned it." Kyle blinked. "Are you sure?" Edward placed a hand on his shoulder. "I watched you tell the truth when it cost you. I watched you grow when most people shrink. And I watched you lead without needing a title to do it." Kyle's jaw tightened. "I won't let you down." "I know," Edward said. A week later, the change became official. No big announcement, no press release. Just a quiet ceremony in the showroom. Staff gathered in a circle, coffee cups in hand, as Edward passed Kyle a small brass nameplate. General Manager, Kyle Murphy. As Kyle stepped forward to speak, he looked out at the same faces that had once taught him everything, good and bad. Some were new, some were still healing, but all of them were watching with hope. "I don't have a long speech," Kyle began, "but I do want to say one thing." He pointed up at the sign on the wall. "Trust is earned here." That's not just something Edward taught us. That's something we proved could be true. And from now on, it's our job to protect it for the next customer, the next employee, the next family that walks through that door. He paused, then repeated what Edward once told him. "Trust isn't sold, it's earned, one honest deal at a time." The room applauded. Some wiped away tears. And as Edward stepped out of the building later that evening, he paused at the edge of the lot. The truck still gleamed beneath the setting Texas sun. But what mattered more, far more, was what you couldn't see. The promises made behind every sale. The mistakes were owned and fixed. The people who finally felt seen, not sold to. Edward got into his car. Not the luxury model, not the showpiece, but the same simple sedan he had driven undercover all those months ago. As he pulled away from Langston Motors, Red River, he didn't look back, because he didn't need to. The future was already in motion, and it was built not on price tags but on principle. Sometimes to rebuild something worth believing in, you have to walk in as a stranger and listen like one. Edward Langston didn't save his business with money. He saved it with courage. The courage to confront the truth, even when it hurts. The courage to protect the quiet voices, and the courage to step aside so the next leader could rise, not through ambition, but through integrity. Because trust isn't built in a day, it's built into the smallest decisions, when no one's watching and no one expects it. And in a world chasing quick wins, Langston Motors proved something timeless. Doing the right thing isn't a weakness. It's the foundation of everything that lasts.